join me in welcoming to the Distinctive Voices program, Aaron Seitz.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. So thanks for coming. It's great to be speaking to a full house. And so the topic of brain training is one that has been kind of very exciting over the last few years. And, the basic idea is that, can we exercise the brain in the same way as we could exercise the body? So, if you look at, physical fitness, over the last half century or so, we learned a lot about the cardiovascular system and muscle physiology. And, at this point, you could come up with a good exercise that will target any muscle group that you want. Or you could come up with a set of exercises that will be optimal for any sort of athletic sport you want to play in or just daily life. And so, when it comes to physical exercise, we know a lot, and this is beneficial. And the real question is, can we do this for the brain? And if you look at, what are the things that people do conventionally for brain training is that, you do Mensa problems or crossword puzzles. Sudoku is kind of the new thing. I liked Simon when I was a kid. And then, of course, reading books, and, all these things, are good activities. But the problem is that they don't do what we want. They're not going to, change our general cognitive abilities. They'll entertain us, and they'll keep us awake. But they're not going to make us have better memory. Now, we have these new neuroscience-inspired games. And so this is just a collection that I put together yesterday when I was browsing the web, because it seems like every day we have another company. And that, they range anti-aging games, have fun, stay young. I like Learning RX, train the brain, get smarter, guaranteed. And, the real question is that, whoever you are, whether you're young and you use, jungle memory, or whether you're old and you use anti-aging games, there's somebody who's going to sell you a product, and they're going to promise that this is going to make you smarter. And now they're saying that, neuroscience is what is inspiring these games. And so since it's about the brain, it must work. And what's interesting is just last week, there was a statement that came out from the Stanford Institute for Longevity and the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. And they stated as a consensus on brain training industry from the scientific community. And the statement they have, and it's actually, there's a longer letter, but the key paragraph is, we object to the claim that brain games offer consumers a scientifically grounded avenue to reduce or reverse cognitive decline when there is no compelling scientific evidence to date that they do. The promise of a magic bullet detracts from the best evidence to date, which is that cognitive health in old age reflects long-term effects of healthy, engaged lifestyles. And the judgment of the signatories below, and there's about 70 fairly distinguished scientists, exaggerated and misleading claims exploit the anxieties of older adults about the impending cognitive decline. We encourage continued careful research and validation in this field. And actually, I think it's a very good thing that this statement came out, because the key, and this is what I'm going to be talking about, is that it's not that we can't create things that have great potential. It's that what companies are selling nowadays, some of them work a little, some will help some people a lot, but there's not clear evidence of which things are good, which things aren't. And that what we really need is some clarity of, what is the evidence that a given product has some benefit. And what's inspired me is really the question of, can we solve this problem? Can we make brain training games that truly have world impact? And so the idea, and this is the target of my research, is that what you want is that you do this brain training, and not that you then do some test and the test says your memory is better. Instead, what you want is that you go to the grocery store and you actually remember what you're supposed to get. So what I'm going to lead you through is first kind of a test case. And this is kind of the beginning of how I got into this field. And it's the question of vision. Is, can we improve vision in a way that will actually see things better? And what I'm going to tell you is kind of lead you through the approach of how I try to address this problem. And then I'll talk a little bit about how a similar approach might help with other things. And so the first question is that if we want to use neuroscience to come up with a way to train the brain, we need to understand something about how does the brain process visual information. And so here what you have is, someone's looking at something, and that light goes to the eyes. The first synapse is in the thalamus, and then it's really in the back of the head, right back in primary visual cortex, which is the first part of neocortex that receives information about the visual world. And so the question is, what does primary visual cortex see? And this is probably one of the best studied areas of the brain. And so there are some basic things we know. So for instance, this is actually a pattern of light that was flashed on and off. So each of these little black checks was switched between white and black for a period of about 45 minutes or so as a monkey was looking at it. And the monkey's eyes were fixed, so they couldn't move its eyes. And this is actually a cutout of the primary visual cortex where they stained it for metabolic activity. And so they could basically see which cells were active during this period of time. And you actually see a point-by-point correspondence with locations in the retina and locations in the brain. And so, for instance, H is here, and there's another point that's reversed, so, up is down. But basically, the key thing is this idea of retinotopy, is that the layout of neurons in primary visual cortex respects the layout of the neurons in the retina. There's other things that we know, is that Ubel and Wiesel at Harvard Medical School got the Nobel Prize for discovering that if you stuck an electrode into the back of the head and you recorded from these cells and you showed it all sorts of different objects and you try to find, what is the stimulus which is best for this cell, what they discovered is that different neurons like different orientations. So some liked vertical bars of light, some liked horizontal bars of light. They liked different spatial frequencies. So basically, sometimes you like lines that are very tight, other times lines that are a little bit more wide. And what's interesting about this is that this gives us a clue of, what is the operation that primary visual cortex does. How does it break up the visual information into something the brain can process? And to give you an intuition of what might be going on, we could look at JPEG compression. So with JPEG compression, what it does is you basically take a picture and you draw a grid over it. And within each grid, you apply this filter bank. And if you look going down here, that you actually have this change, similar to the spatial frequencies I showed you before. So here you saw we got from wide lines to narrow lines, once again, from wide lines to narrow lines. And then kind of this bit is mathematically similar to the changes of orientation. And what's interesting is that what we do with our computer vision systems is that we break down the image into these filters. And this is an effective way to compress things. And then we could reconstruct the image. And what's nice is that there's mathematical proofs that show that you could perfectly describe any image by these types of filters at different locations. And so, this is kind of one of the first things that we need to understand if we want to try to train the brain to be able to see better is, how is it seeing in the first place? And then, if we look at other visual areas, what we'll see is that some will respond to 3D objects and some to faces and some to motion patterns. And what's happening is that, after you break down the image, then other brain areas reconstruct different aspects of it. And so the question is, how do we teach the visual system? And this is something where the field really has been changing. So kind of old textbooks, this classic idea of the critical period has dominated, where the idea of the critical period is that when you're very young, the brain is plastic. And so this is the way that the visual system, when the eyes first open, are able to kind of learn the statistics of the visual world and do the right thing. And then when you're an adult, that it's fixed. Maybe it deteriorates, but there's not much plasticity. And so What I'm showing you here is this is actually another cutout of a monkey brain. I'm sorry for the monkeys. But what they did here is that they had one eye that was, in this case, actually removed. And then the other eye was open, and they're able to see the white areas there and on this computer process image are the ones that are responding to the eye that's open. And the dark areas are the ones that would have been responding to the other eye. And what's interesting is that, so this is the adult-like looking pattern of behavior. And here, this is what happens if, after 1 week of life, that in this case, one eye was enucleated, and then the other eye was able to be open for a long period of time. And what you see is that the eye that is left takes over almost all visual cortex, so it's almost all white. This is an animal that after 12 weeks of life, the same experiment was done. But still, after 1 year, you see that there's a lot of brain areas that are still only responding to the eye that's no longer there. And so this is the idea of the critical period, is that we know that the adult brain is much less plastic. On the other hand, one of the reasons I'm here speaking to you is that what I've done in most of my scientific career is look at visual perceptual learning. And this is a field where we train people on tasks like this, where it's a little bit hard to see here, but if you look at this red dot, you could see this oriented pattern that's surrounding it. As you go from the right to the left, it's harder and harder to see. And so what we typically do is we generate these psychometric functions, which on the x-axis, we have signal strength, so just how many of these pixels are of this Gabor pattern. And then on the y-axis, how accurate people are at being able to detect it. And so the more signal you have, the better you are. And then we'll train people using some variety of techniques for a week, 2 weeks, a month. And then we look to see how the psychometric function shifts, so that at the same signal strength, performance will be better. And I'm going to just kind of give you an idea of what some of these basic research experiments look like. I'm going to show you kind of one of my most fanciful ones. This is actually one of the ones that helped me get the job at UC Riverside. So I'd actually done some work working with monkeys. And so I learned that if you want to train somebody on a task, that you food and water deprive them, and you put a tube in their mouth, and you give them drops of water as reward. And so this is Dong Ho Kim, graduate student I was working with at the time, kind of showing the experimental apparatus, where what we did is we actually food and water deprived human subjects for about 5 hours before each session. We put this tube in the mouth, and that every so often would give them drops of water, and that these were coordinated with what was shown on the computer screen. So their only task was to stare at this red dot and try to stay awake. And they did this for about an hour a day for about 20 days, while thirsty. And we could see is that every so often there's an oriented pattern. There is one there. We'll see another in a moment. There we go. And that will come on. And so with one of these patterns, we'd give a drop of water. With the other pattern, we didn't. And so we're trying to see whether we could find a change in visual sensitivity. So how well people could distinguish these patterns just by the presence of a drop of water with one of the stimulus. But we're trying to actually in this experiment prove that you could learn without attention. And so we had to go one step further. And so what I'm showing you here is what's called a haploscope. And so a haploscope is a system of mirrors where someone is sitting here. There's actually a bite bar in this experiment, and that they're looking at these two mirrors. So there's one mirror is looking at this computer monitor on the left, the other mirror on the right, and so that each eye is getting a different image. And what we do with this is that the left eye will show a pattern like this with this bright, colorful mondrian. And don't worry, I will get to the games in a moment, but this is the preface. And that to the other eye, this is really hard to see, but it's a very faint version of that pattern I showed you before. So we have these orientations coming up every so often. And if you see these mismatched inputs to your two eyes, this dominates. So people never, ever saw this pattern that was being paired with the drops of water. And what we were able to find was that the orientation that was paired with this drop of water, even though they never saw it during the 20 days of training, that the psychometric function got better. So the red line is higher than the blue line, and so that they improved. And with the control orientation, so this was shown equal numbers of times, that there's no change. And what's interesting is that this learning effect was, so it's specific to the orientation. It's actually also specific to the eye that was exposed to the stimulus. And so this gets to an important point, and this is a point which is also true of a lot of the brain training games, is this issue of specificity. Is that one of the issues that has dominated the field of perceptual learning, and is a real problem in terms of the brain training games as well, is that what's often found is that the learning effects that you learn on one task are highly specific to that training task and don't transfer to other things. And so in this case, if you train people, so you're looking at this one point and you train them at something in the lower right-hand visual field, you then test them at a different location, learning effects don't necessarily transfer. You could change the orientation, it doesn't transfer. And then in the example I just showed you, if you train them where they had all the stimuli to one eye, you could get an improved threshold cross time, so they get better at this task. You then switch it so they do the same task in the other eye, and they sometimes have to start over. And when you look at this field of visual perceptual learning, you could take any visual task, whether it's these low-level visual stimuli or whether it's textures or faces or crowding, that almost anything you could name, somebody has performed a training task to train people to get better. They've shown people could get better, and then they found that the learning was specific. And so the question, and I started with this in the vision case, and now I'm trying to apply it to other cases, is really how would you improve real-world vision? How would you train something that would transfer to the wide array of visual tasks that we perform? And so actually, these pictures aren't chosen randomly. I'm actually working with people in all these groups. So I'm working with radiologists to train them to see better. I've worked with the LAPD latent print examiners to see if they could better see fingerprints after visual training. People with low vision. I'll show you some data from the baseball team. And also, actually, I need to fix this because this is supposed to be an image of a car driving off a cliff. And the idea is if you could see better, you won't drive off cliffs. But the key thing is that these are the things that we want to use vision for. And so the idea is, okay, how would one improve vision? And what needs to realize is that there are two components, or two main components of vision. One are the optics of the eye. So that if the image on the back of the retina is not clear, then you're not going to see well. And so this is why you might get glasses or LASIK or cataract surgery, and that there's a huge vision enterprise that is focused on how to make the eye work better. But when it comes down to it, if you have a stroke and so you have damage to primary visual cortex, you're blind. The only way you see anything is that the brain has to process this visual information. And that the idea that the brain does this optimally is kind of silly. We know that everything else gets worse if we don't practice. So if you don't exercise, you're not going to be physically fit. And so the idea that the visual system is optimally processing visual information just doesn't really make sense. And also the fact that these perceptual learning studies show that anything you train on, you get better, shows that, one, the adult visual system is plastic, and two, that it's not optimal. And so the idea is that if you really want to have the best vision, you should both improve the optics of the eye, and you should find a way to exercise the brain. And so the question is, why are all of these perceptual learning studies specific to the features that are being trained? And one of the reasons is their simplicity, is that they tend to train only on very simple stimuli. And so, for instance, these are examples of standard tasks. So in this task, a vernier acuity task is supposed to judge whether these two lines are lined up or, in this case, offset. And that people are extremely good at doing this. You could basically detect offsets that are smaller than the spacing between photoreceptors in the retina. or detecting these very faint Gabor stimuli that either in this case is just dim, or in that case mask the noise. And that if you train with these stimuli at one location in the visual field, at one orientation for like a month, why should you expect this learning to transfer to other things in the world? I mean, you're becoming a specialist for that stimulus. And that people, including myself, have used this as a tool to understand mechanisms of learning. But you shouldn't expect that the same approach that you take for your scientific study is necessarily going to be the one that is going to have translational benefit. And the things that we've learned from these types of studies, so like for instance, this first one, so this is the study that I just showed you, is that what it teaches us is about how reward helps with the learning process. So that even without knowing the stimulus is there, is that the relationship between that stimulus and a reward is something that trains the brain to be able to process that stimulus better. And if you look across the field, there's also other studies that have told us similar principles. So, attention is that you learn better the things that you focus on, and the things you ignore, you don't learn as well. Or I've done a lot of research on multisensory facilitation. What happens if you have sounds that tell you something about the visual stimulus you're looking at? What we found is that you learn more quickly and you learn better. So the auditory system will teach the visual system. There's lots of studies that look at rules of synaptic plasticity and how we could, take electrical stimulation protocols that people use for individual neurons, and you could actually, flash lights or even electrically stimulate the brain and get some plasticity with these. Or a key one is that instead of just showing one stimulus for a very long time, if you show a bunch of different stimuli, that if you have diversity of what you're training on, you'll generalize better. And then what's been really interesting is that there's been a lot of studies that show that playing video games of different types will actually cause good learning. And so we could take all of these and take a different approach than the typical lab study. And this new approach is you say, instead of what will help us understand a mechanism, what might lead to the best learning process? And this is where I got started with this game, Ultimize, where I got together with some people in the video game industry. And so for this part, I do have, to create this program, I had to create a company. And so I'll disclose, I am a chief scientist of Carrot Technology. And so I haven't got a cent yet from it, but I do have a conflict of interest, hopefully. And the idea is, can we, put all these principles together and put them explicitly into a training program that has the goal of getting generalization? And so here what you're seeing is that people are clicking on these different Gabor stimuli, which are a little bit hard to see here, which is, these ones are easier, but basically you're blowing up these Gabors, and I don't like Gabors, and so I want to blow them up. And we show them at different orientations and different spatial frequencies, and sometimes you have to distinguish them from distractors. And then as you play the game, what it does is it measures how well you are at finding them and tries to make them as difficult as you can. And there's a bunch of tricks that are built into this, but the key idea is that everything that I showed you before, all those rules, were explicitly built into the game. And so that's one part, is come up with a design that at least has the intent of transferring. And the next thing is, how do we show that this actually has a benefit outside the lab? And this is actually something which is difficult. And so we thought a lot about this, and eventually we came up with the idea of training baseball players. And the reason for this is that, what I do in my career is I measure things. And that I want to have good quantitative measures to see whether there's a benefit or not of whatever I'm training on. And the nice thing about baseball is that everything is measured in this sport. And so, people obsess about, I learned the term sabermetrics, which is a special term for baseball statistics based upon the Saber Society, which has created a lot of these techniques. And that what is nice about baseball is it's a highly visually demanding sport. So, these hitters have to hit balls that are sometimes traveling 100 plus miles per hour. And if you look at professional baseball players, their vision is much, much better than the average individual. So that, the average individual, when you're young, vision's maybe 2018 to 2020. In professional baseball players, you're looking more like, 2010 to 2015. And so we convinced the UC Riverside baseball coach to allow us to do a study with his players. And, one thing that comes up with a lot of these studies is, do you do randomized placebo-controlled studies? And in this case, the coach said you could train our hitters and you could use our pitchers as a control group. And, that was that. And so, there's a certain reality in terms of, what you were able to get when you try to do a study like this. And so what we did is, we trained the position players, and we had them conduct 30, 25-minute sessions across a 2-month period of time with this optimized game. And before and after this, we did a bunch of vision tests. Actually, the vision tests were done right before the training, and then again 1 month after the training completed. And then the baseball season started 3 months after the training completed. And the first thing we found was that there was actually fairly dramatic changes in vision. So that, these are, standard eye charts stuck on the wall, and that we found that there's about a 30% change in distance vision and about a 20% change in near vision. And what this means is that, and this was only for the trained players. The pitchers didn't show any changes. And what this meant was that the team's vision on average started off at 2013. So this meant what the average person could see at 13 feet, they could stand 20 feet back and read. On average, they got down to 2010. And then 7 of the players got to 27.5, which meant that what a typical person could see at 7.5 feet, they could stand 20 feet back and read. And this is kind of shocking. And what I will say is that don't think that if you start playing Ultimize, your vision's automatically going to be 27.5. One has to be very careful with what claims they make. But it is nice evidence that this type of training can yield a change in vision, at least measured on an eye chart. And then another thing we looked at is this contrast sensitivity function. Because if you just look at visual acuity, that a standard eye chart only tells you one small aspect of vision. And that what you could see here is that if you look at the left, where these are kind of low spatial frequencies, the bars are wide, you need a lot of light to be able to see the pattern. As you go towards the middle, you could see it when there's very little light. And as you go to the right, it comes back down, so it's harder to see. And so this is something that basically measures both your ability to see things that are low contrast and your acuity at the same time. And that this function, which is kind of a broader test of vision, also changed. So the blue line is the pre-test, the red is the post-test. And so that, there's kind of these broad-based changes in the vision. In another study, we actually looked at peripheral vision. So we had people with an eye tracker, and so they had to stare at the point at the center of the screen. And only when they were looking at that point, we'd flash stimuli in the periphery. And we found that both peripheral acuity and contrast sensitivity got better. And, when we asked the players, did you notice any changes? And, this is something where one has to be very careful about self-report, but it's also good to know if people do notice things. Because if they notice nothing, then that's kind of discouraging. If they notice something, you could always complain, well, maybe it's just a placebo effect. But at least we're getting that. And so they could see the ball better while hitting. They could get better peripheral vision, see things better in dim light. Actually, some of the players would start reporting that they could start seeing the stitching on the ball and the direction of the spin. And so, and this is something which is really associated with some of the kind of the great hitters. And so the real question is, getting to these real world benefits. And so did vision training improve baseball? And so here, actually, I got some help from a colleague, Dan Ozer, who's a quantitative psychologist and also a huge baseball fan. Okay, so he taught me some about sabermetrics. And so the first thing we did is that since we didn't have a good control group, that we wanted to find, what would be a control group. And so we took all the UC Riverside players who had played both in the 2012 baseball season, which was before we did training, and the 2013 baseball season, which was after. and we compared them to all the other players in the Big West League, so their competitive league, to see how they compared. And the basic idea is that every single team, every year, has some special intervention that they're doing to try to make them win. And ours is just one of these, and actually not even one that necessarily the players thought would work. Because if you take a baseball player to the psych lab and say, hey, do this computer program, will make you play better at baseball, there are some skeptics. So what we found is first that if you looked at the UC Riverside baseball team, that the strikeout percentage reduced I wouldn't say tremendously, but statistically significantly, in that there is a reduction from 22.1% strikeouts to 17.7%. They started off worse than the rest of the league, and didn't end up as good as the league. But if you break down to individual players, so like take the top half of the team and the bottom half, they both showed these same improvements. And in fact, going back, we looked at every single team year-to-year change over a 5-year period, and this is the only case where there's a statistically significant change year-to-year in strikeouts. We then used some of Bill James' Moneyball formulas, and so this is where the sabermetrics came in, and we're able to calculate this statistic called runs created. And the basic idea is that you could estimate from a number of offensive baseball statistics how many runs they should have gotten from that playing. And what we could do is we could then look at the typical maturational changes in the non-UCR players. We could subtract that out, and we could find that there were 41 extra runs created in the UCR team above what would be expected if they improved at the same rate as the Big West League. And then my favorite thing in sabermetrics is there's a Pythagorean theorem of baseball. And what this allows you to do is take runs created, and you compare this to the runs allowed, so how many runs the other team score on you. And you could compute from this how many games they should have won. And we're able to compare that to how much they should have won if they improved at typical league rates. And this translates to 4.7 extra games out of a 54-game season. And, here's where I'll kind of start with the cautions, is that, it's hard to say that, the vision training made them win 5 extra games. And I think that one has to be cautious in terms of the effect sizes, that I think there's, good evidence that it made some impact. But, it's unclear, how much of this is that they were seeing better, and how much of it is that they felt more confident because they were seeing better. How much of it is because they felt more confident because they were able to go to the psych lab. And so, with all these studies, one both has to look, hey, is there promise in this technique? And two, one has to say, what can one truly conclude? And so the fact is that on one hand, I'm very excited about this. On the other hand, I realize it is a small sample. It's not a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. But it does show an impact on people's activity outside the lab. And actually, I'm doing a bunch of different studies in order to look at broader effects of this vision training. So I'm working with actually some professional baseball players at this point. I've worked with police departments, radiologists, people with various mental health conditions, schizophrenia, dyslexia, ADHD, and then lots of people with low vision. And in all these studies, what I'm trying to do is, start off with kind of a proof of principle and then try to move to the place where we're able to have, larger studies that allow us to have kind of clearer conclusions. So the first part I want to say with the vision training is that, the adult visual system does show plasticity, but I think that what we really need in order to unlock it is a different design principle than some of the basic studies, is that instead of trying to pinpoint a mechanism, try to figure out what, from all the mechanisms that would produce the broadest base changes. And based upon this, I started getting excited about, well, can we do the same thing for other aspects of cognition? And so recently, and actually we're still in the process of growing this, but we created the UC Riverside Brain Game Center. And the mission of this center is to create brain training games that really will transfer to real-world activities and to do so in the context of a university-based nonprofit that its only goal is to really discover the truth. And so, I realize, even having a company, that, there's all these pressures of what a company can do, which is great for, I think, translating, lab to marketplace. But a company is not really good at doing truly honest research. And so the real question is, I actually believe that, by proper understanding of brain circuitry, that, whether it's low-level aspects like vision and hearing and touch, or whether it's intermediate things like attention and memory and processing speed and executive function, or even broader things like happiness and well-being, that we have the potential, from what we know of neuroscience, to be able to achieve things that will actually improve all of this. But the real question is, how do we get there? And, a challenge is that, as, this consensus statement of, researchers on the brain training industry is that, we have to have a process where we're allowed to take the time to come up with the proper solutions. And so what we're trying to do at the Brain Game Center is, one, integrate psychology and neuroscience, similar to what I showed you in the vision training study, to really try to, design, what would be the best way to activate a brain circuit of interest. Let's say memory is the next one I'll show you. And then try to, really engage in a way that will improve it in a general way. And then also, use computer science, both in order to try to make games that are more fun, and even more fun than the kind of the whack-a-mole game that I showed you with my vision training. And then also using machine learning and intelligence systems to really model human performance and present them with the right challenges. And so here, we're just getting started with memory training. And so these games are starting to look a little bit more interesting. So this, we'll see. It's a little bit low contrast, but you have the spaceship, and so there's these color targets. And what you're supposed to remember is the sequence of targets, and you're supposed to find a target that's a certain number of items back. So in this case, you're remembering pairs. So there's green and then blue, and so the next thing you'll be looking for is a green object and then a blue object. We're not seeing a target now. But as you get better, what happens is that it goes from a 2 back to a 3 back. We had some subjects who actually got to a 15 back. They could, remember 15 items back in the sequence, whether they saw it, and be able to grab that target. And we do this in a case where it's both engaging in terms of, you have this, game that you're playing, but also you're multitasking. And so when you think about any memory task that we're doing, it's always under some load. We never have the chance to be able to just sit down and stare at something and I'm going to memorize it. Instead, someone's talking to you, you're driving, listening to the radio, and you remember that. There's always something else you're doing. And so trying to train people under distraction is, I think, important. And then also not everybody likes space games, and so we have a similar game where, let's see, is it going to play? Let's see. Maybe one more. Maybe it won't. Oh, there we go. So you have a bee that you're flying around and you're pollinating flowers. And the same basic algorithms are in this, but one idea is that you want people to comply. And so trying to come up with a program that is actually interesting to them, I think is an important goal. And we're using these games, in people with traumatic brain injury, with ADHD, with seniors suffering from cognitive decline. I'm starting to work with some dementia patients. And the idea really is, can we use these to try to strengthen, basic memory processes? And there's preliminary evidence that these types of approaches do work. Another topic we're working on is hearing, because, this is actually a direct analogy with the visual system, and that, we're just beginning to come up with our first prototype. But the question is, how do you attack the auditory system in the way that we approach the visual system? And so first, so here this is the Sylvian fissure of the brain, and so this is where primary auditory cortex is. And that it's a little bit small, but what these are showing is that as you move across auditory cortex, that you have some regions that respond to low frequencies, other cells that respond to higher frequencies, and that they're laid out really in the same way as the cochlea in the inner ear, is that at the very first stage of auditory transduction, we have some regions that respond to low frequencies, some to high frequencies. And so this structure is preserved in primary auditory cortex. But that this is not really the most basic feature of these auditory neurons. Instead, and this is an example if you're looking at speech. So this is time would be on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis. And what we're showing are spectrograms of the word lock or the word rock. And the reason I'm showing these is that L versus R is kind of a classic distinction that native Japanese speakers have trouble making. And the reason for this is that the only real difference between these waveforms is this third band here, where for lock it's going down, and for rock it's going up. I highlighted it, so right in here. And if you look at primary auditory cortex, and you record from a neuron to try to find what they're most sensitive to, what you find is that they like stimuli that are kind of like this. These are called ripples. They're actually mathematically the same as the Gabors, but there's basically just that same function, but in time on the x-axis and the frequency on the y-axis. So it kind of sounds like this. Let's see. And then here's another one. And so some neurons like sounds that are going down in frequency, others that are going up in frequency. And so what we're doing actually with the first version of this study is that we identified a bunch of veterans with traumatic brain injury that, they come back from Iraq or Afghanistan, and they have a lot of trouble hearing, so they go to the audiologist, and the audiologist tests their hearing with these pure tones. Basically, you play a pure tone, you make it as quiet as possible. The audiologist says, you have perfect hearing, no problem. But they can't understand language. And then if you play, in some of these patients, either just a word that's quiet, they can't understand it. Or even worse, you play a word that's loud and you have some noise, they can't hear it. And what's happening is that, there's nothing wrong as far as people could tell with the inner ear. But the neurons that are responding to these changes of frequency over time don't seem to be doing their job. And so what we're trying to do here, and we don't know yet whether it will work, is that if we could come up with a game where we train them on these types of stimuli, maybe we're able to help them regain some of their speech comprehension. And so this is a project we're at the very beginnings at, but it's quite exciting. And so, coming back to, the first theme of this brain fitness, there's a lot of discussion now as a myth or reality. And I think the basic statement is that, right now it is true in the field there's a certain amount of snake oil. And I think that there's definitely importance of buyer beware. But in terms of our potential of creating, appropriate exercise routines that will really strengthen targeted brain circuits, I think we're really at the point where we have the knowledge to do this right. And I think that with proper research that, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, we're going to have a lot of very exciting things. And I think that, the brain fitness is going to be as normal as physical fitness. And with that, I'd like to thank, so this is my lab at UC Riverside. This is Victor Zorden, the computer scientist I'm starting the Brain Game Center with. Dan Ozer, he's the sabermetrician who helped me with the baseball studies. And of course, the UC Riverside baseball team. Without them, I wouldn't be here.